The time for talk is over. Now, the biggest countries on Earth are fighting for global supremacy. What would happen if the United States started World War III? Who would the US attack first? Could we use robot soldiers? Or would nuclear power win the day? This is What If, and here's what would happen if the United States started World War III. Imagine that for decades, the tension between the United States, Russia, and China has been rising. Whether it's through spies or tariffs, these nations constantly battle to one-up each other and control the resources on our planet. Combating two enemies at once sounds difficult, right? Well, what about 50 or 100? If you're up to the challenge, download Conflict of Nations, the free online strategy game that allows you to compete with up to 128 players in epic battles as you fight to dominate a virtual world. You can declare war on your neighbors or become allies while you defend your country with tanks, jets, and even nuclear weapons. In Conflict of Nations, you control a real country's resources, terrain, and population in a complex strategy game that could last weeks. Play right now using the same account across your PC, iOS, and Android devices, and immerse yourself in a modern warfare simulator that redefines strategy and combat. Are you ready to take over the world? Well, click on the link in the description below and get 1 month of premium subscription free, plus 13,000 gold. But hurry, this exclusive offer is only available for 30 days. Collect your gift, choose your country, and fight to conquer World War III. While wars of the past started over border disputes and assassinations, World War III could start in a virtual space. And if another cyber attack from China triggers the United States to respond, the conflict could grow into the most devastating war ever known. But if a war started tomorrow, would technology dominate over humans? World War II claimed about 75 million lives from 1939 to 1945. It left Japan and Europe in shambles and scarred a generation. But if the United States starts World War III, the death toll could be much higher and happen faster. And with the trade war between the United States and China escalating, the Western superpower could attack one of its biggest rivals. So, what weapons would it use to strike first? Drone technology has changed the face of modern warfare during the past few years, and now you may not even see it coming. The military could outfit drones with adaptive camouflage, small electronic panels that can display different patterns. These lightweight aircraft could slip right by you and you wouldn't know until it's too late. But what if these drones attacked you? Weapons manufacturers are developing a compact laser capable of shooting down missiles, aircraft, and drones. While your naked eye could miss these high-flying threats, the laser's powerful beam could track and tear through these drones. And on the ground, soldiers could have the same kind of precision weapons. Self-steering bullets could change how troops eliminate moving targets when fighting face-to-face. While the US government hasn't disclosed the details of how this technology works, these bullets have frightening accuracy, even in windy conditions. But as 2020 taught us, populations can be decimated without a bullet ever being fired. The Centers for Disease Control listed 30 microorganisms and toxins that terrorists could weaponize against a population. with the right delivery systems, these warring nations could use pathogens like the hantavirus or anthrax against each other. While bioweapons are nothing new, most agents lose 50% of their effectiveness in the air due to heat and humidity. But if nations want to cause mass destruction, they would unleash the worst weapon they have available. Although China has over 100 missile silos, the government has said they wouldn't strike first. But if this war became desperate enough, that could change. The United States owns over 5,600 nuclear missiles, and its political rival, Russia, has over 6,000 warheads ready to strike. But the idea of mutually assured destruction has prevented all sides from using this apocalyptic threat. But if cyber attacks took down air defenses and missile controls, all bets might be off. One warhead exploded over New York could instantly take out 300,000 people. Moscow and its surrounding areas could suffer almost 200,000 deaths in the blink of an eye. And that's only if 2 warheads were launched, one over each city. City after city across the globe could be wiped out in this war to end all wars. On July 13, 2024, Donald Trump escaped an attempt on his life. He managed to turn his head at just the right angle so that a bullet shot in his direction grazed his ear rather than hitting him in the head. But what would happen if he didn't turn his head? What if Donald Trump was assassinated that day? Who would replace him? And could this lead to an American Civil War? In this video, we're going to go through multiple scenarios on what would happen if Donald Trump got assassinated. The first one we'll look at is if he actually got shot on July 13th. Now, I need to be clear that at the time of this recording, the assassination attempt is still being investigated, so some details may change, but what we do know is that the shooter came incredibly close. Another thing that I want to make clear is that I don't wish ill will toward anyone. If you're new to the channel, you should know that we often look at news stories and give our hypothetical take on it. That's all that this is. In Butler, Pennsylvania, on July 13th, the assassin shot from 140 meters away. Trump had just turned his head a couple of centimeters. If he hadn't have done this, it's very likely that he would have been killed by the bullet. Instead, the shot grazed his ear. If he hadn't been so lucky, we'd be looking at a completely different world today. Donald Trump would be dead. So, what would happen next? One of the most important things that would need to be figured out would be who would take the mantle of the Republican presidential nominee. It all depends on when this happens. The answer can change, if it were before the Republican National Convention or after. So, in the case of the July 13th assassination attempt, things would get a little more complicated. Since this event happened right before the Republican National Convention, which was set for July 15th, the delegates involved in selecting the Republican presidential nominee would have to move incredibly fast. With little time in between the shooting and the convention, the nominee would likely be decided on the convention floor that night. It would be incredibly messy and frantic. There'd be backroom deals and public speeches from the hopeful nominees. Now, since Trump had no strong opposition during the primaries, almost everyone could be considered. It would be like going back to square one. Even people who didn't run in the primaries could be nominated. This would be a night full of bids for power, and whoever's left standing would be the Republican nominee, who would then run for president. Now, there are some other scenarios that we'll get into in a bit, but what might happen outside of politics? Well, the answer to that is a lot more unknown and potentially terrifying. Donald Trump was seen yelling "fight" after he got shot, and there's a good chance his supporters would do just that. Now, we're not saying everyone, but the extreme fringe of his base might possibly engage. Just look what happened on January 6th, 2021. Trump supporters stormed the United States Capitol building. This was after their emotions were stoked by talk about a stolen election, a claim that was proven to be false. So, what would happen if their leader was assassinated? Well, they'd likely be looking for someone to blame, potentially a group of people or the opposing party. Donald Trump has incredibly passionate supporters, more passionate than what we've seen from almost any other political figure in the past. There's a good chance there could be outbursts of violence and civil unrest. Hopefully, this violence would be contained to small pockets of the country and not become a full-on civil war. With Biden still being president and commander-in-chief, he's in control of the military. If things got out of hand, hopefully they'd be able to put a stop to it. And hopefully no bigger militias would form either. Now, even without any violence, Trump would be idolized even more than he is today. Supporters would make him a martyr. And if some people on the left were happy that this happened, this would create an even bigger political divide across the country. The new Republican nominee would certainly use this as fuel to energize voters, turning him or her into an even stronger candidate. And more Trump supporters might be inspired to vote in the election now, even without him in the race. But what if Trump wasn't dead, but incapacitated? Well, technically the rules and laws that are in place would still apply, but there could be more nuance. If there's a chance Trump comes back and he's healthy, then the party would likely debate whether or not he could continue as the nominee. They'd also consider if he'd be in good enough shape to be sworn in if he potentially became president. Now, the story is a little bit different if the assassination attempt happened after the RNC on July 15th. Donald Trump would be elected as their nominee, so what would happen if he were to die before the election? Well, you might think that his running mate would be automatically elevated, so his current choice for vice president, J.D. Vance, would become the presidential nominee, but that's not the case. The nominee for president would still be voted upon by the Republican Party. They might go back to square one and reconvene the National Convention, or they might just select a new candidate. There's a good chance that Trump's running mate would become the presidential nominee, but it's not a guarantee. Other party members might want to get into the mix. Now, the same rules would apply if Trump won the election on November 5th. That would make him the president-elect until Inauguration Day on January 20th. If he were to die between those dates, the vice president-elect doesn't automatically become president. Since Trump wouldn't officially be sworn in, the 25th Amendment, which allows the vice president to become president if the current one dies, wouldn't be applicable. Now, this got me thinking, could anything like this potentially delay the election? Well, technically it could, but it's incredibly unlikely. Election day is set by federal law, and it's November 5th. In order for this to change, it would need to be voted on in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. The president would need to sign off as well, but this can only happen if both parties are in agreement, which seems unlikely, especially given the political divide gripping the United States. Also, this would only delay the election by a couple of weeks. As the Constitution states, a president needs to be sworn in by January 20th of the following year. Failing that, there would be no president and things could get really ugly. Now, this is how the election would be handled, which boils down to a lot of bureaucracy and systems we already have in place. What happens next could be extreme civil unrest, violence, anger, a potential civil war. It's safe to say this would be a scary time for America, for a number of reasons. On the other hand, maybe a violent act like this might inspire Americans to put down their weapons and come together. But considering the political division, that seems unlikely. Now, this is not a fun hypothetical scenario. Regardless of where you stand on the political spectrum, it would be a scary time for Americans and for people around the world. Let's just hope this assassination attempt doesn't lead to any further violent acts. I know I don't want to end up in a World War III.
Ever since Russia invaded Ukraine,
The world has been afraid of one thing: Russia's nukes. But what exactly would happen if Russian President Vladimir Putin decided to push the red button? What could lead to Putin detonating a nuclear weapon? What chain of command would this order need to follow? And what would happen if NATO's member countries fought back? This is What If, and here's what would happen if Russia launched a nuke. When the United States attacked the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, it marked the only 2 times in history that nuclear weapons have been used during a time of war. The destruction and casualties from these bombs were devastating. Combined, an estimated 120,000 people were killed instantly, and tens of thousands more in the following months. People within 1 kilometer of the detonations were carbonized by heat rays, and those within 1.5 kilometers from ground zero suffered flash burning and severe damage to their skin. Fast forward to today, and Russia has more nukes than any other country. And Putin has already ordered Russia's nuclear forces on high alert, threatening any country that sides with Ukraine. So, could the world be on a razor's edge of a nuclear winter? Based on Russia's policies on nuclear deterrence, there are a few basic principles by which Putin could make the decision to use nuclear weapons. One of the reasons for this world-changing launch could be ballistic missiles aimed at Russia or its allies. Another might be any attack on critical government or military sites that would undermine Russia's nuclear forces' ability to respond. Finally, and maybe the most concerning of reasons, is the use of conventional weapons against Russia that it perceives as a direct threat to its existence. Yeah, this means that Russia could launch nukes if any member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, started to directly intervene in the war in Ukraine. And it's this kind of nuclear posturing that has led to many Western leaders indicating that there's a limit to how far they would go to help Ukraine defend against Russia. Now, if this were to go down, it would all begin with Putin and a small briefcase that he keeps close to him at all times. This is known as the Chiget, and it would connect the Russian dictator to the command network of Russia's nuclear forces. Putin wouldn't be just pushing a big red button to launch. Instead, he would transmit launch orders to the General Staff, which is his central military command. The Russian General Staff would then launch nuclear missiles by sending authorization codes to individual weapons commanders. Or, in case the command posts were destroyed, they could bypass those by using a backup system called Perimeter. This would allow the General Staff to directly initiate the launch of land-based missiles remotely. If they were to do that, these land-based missiles would take about 30 minutes to reach a country like the United States. If the launch came from a submarine positioned closer to US territory, it would only take 10 to 15 minutes for the strike to land. Once launched, the US military's space-based infrared system would detect any missiles with infrared radiation. Within minutes, President Joe Biden would be alerted, and a few moments later, the response would likely be an immediate, massive counterattack. That would mean the deployment of potentially hundreds, if not thousands of aircraft, nuclear submarines, and land-based heavy artillery vehicles armed with missiles. But even this huge military action would still only be a reaction to the first launch. Imagine if a warhead detonated in Washington, D.C., just a few blocks away from the White House. Even if this device was only 2/3 as powerful as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, everything within approximately 1 kilometer would be destroyed. Over 45,000 people would be killed and another 300,000 more injured. Anyone within 8 kilometers could be temporarily blinded by the overwhelming flash of light from the blast. People as far as 30 kilometers away from the explosion could be enveloped in a mixture of dust, debris, and deadly byproducts of radiation. This would be a terrible preview of the devastating effects that any further escalation could have on the whole world, not just North America. If Russia and the United States detonated their full arsenal of nuclear weapons, the entire planet would be covered with a blanket of soot in only 2 weeks. The soot would block sunlight and could lower the temperatures to below freezing even in the summer months. And it could take 10 years for it to dissipate. The threat of nuclear war is terrifying, but all may not be totally lost. Russia's army was considered to be one of the most powerful in the world, but their invasion of Ukraine has revealed that the Russian army may be more inadequately equipped and poorly trained than expected. The looming threat of nuclear war could just be another way for Russia to keep the world in a submissive state of fear. Putin may or may not have gone insane. He sure is unstable, but he's not the only person involved in launching nukes. Besides, nuclear war isn't a game. If you were the first person to launch a nuclear strike, you'd have very likely ensured your own death. Our planet is on the brink of another devastating world war. And while it's terrifying to imagine the realities this conflict could bring to people all over the world, this time it could play out on a battlefield unlike any other: space. Which nations would be the main cosmic combatants? What kinds of never-before-seen weaponry would be used? And would it ever end? This is What If, and here's what would happen if World War III was fought in space. Before we launch into the cosmic battleground of World War III, let's take a look at the terrestrial tensions leading us to the brink of war. No matter when exactly the full-scale conflict would erupt, the stage has been set already for quite some time. Many of the geopolitical rivalries and alliances have already been compounding and could ignite beyond our atmosphere at any moment. A digital arms race for technological supremacy has been brewing between the US, China, and Russia. But this cyber warfare isn't the only realm where the most powerful nations on Earth have already been disputing. International agreements such as the Nuclear Forces Treaties are eroding. Climate change is turning the Arctic into a strategic military position, and nations are already developing all kinds of anti-satellite and other space-capable technologies. With the boundaries between Earth and space getting blurrier, this powder keg of international relations is about to blow right out of the atmosphere. If a violent international conflict erupted in the final frontier, would we even be able to call it a world war? Well, debating this name wouldn't be very helpful when the fight would be unfolding on entirely new dimensions. Okay, not literally in new dimensions, yet. The war would still be limited by our four-dimensional framework of space and time. That's not to say that even further in the future we could be fighting interdimensional wars. Let's just not get too far ahead of ourselves. The technologies of space warfare would be a leap beyond our current capabilities. The three most powerful nations, and others with advanced space programs like India, Japan, and the European Union, would need to accelerate the development of an entirely new arsenal of weapons. Satellites, old and new, would become active components of the various war machines. They could be reconfigured into highly sophisticated communications scramblers, anti-missile defense systems, or even high-energy laser beams. This could sound like science fiction, and it is, but it's only the beginning. Each of the warring nations would soon develop spacecraft to fight on battlegrounds beyond traditional orbits. These spacecraft could be both human-controlled and autonomous. But they'd likely resemble advanced fighter jets designed for intricate maneuvering in the vacuum of space. And they'd carry highly destructive weaponry to engage in short-range dogfights with enemy spaceships, as well as long-range laser weapons to attack targets back on Earth. Among some of the most terrifying new weapons that could wreak havoc and destruction on terrestrial targets would be the so-called rods from God. Now, all that stuff might sound like pure sci-fi, but I regret to inform you that these could be an actual real-life possibility. The rods from God would be dense, heavy rods made of tungsten that could be dropped from satellites down onto Earth. They would measure over 6 meters in length and weigh nearly 4.5 tons. Yeah, known as a kinetic bombardment rod, these weapons would accelerate to incredible speeds as they descend through the atmosphere. Upon impact, they'd carry the force of a nuclear weapon, but without any of the radioactive fallout. Entire cities could be wiped out with the press of a button. So, although this war is primarily fought in space, Earth could still suffer some serious consequences. But more on that in a bit. The concept for this radical weapon has been around since the aftermath of the Second World War. It was developed by a researcher for Boeing as a way to deliver devastating blows without the need for deploying nuclear weapons. In the battleground of space, weapons like these would be a game changer. And the satellites carrying these rods would be highly strategic targets to take out to avoid massive casualties from artificial meteor strikes. One of the most essential strategic sites in a war in space would be the biggest of all satellites in orbit, the Moon. This celestial body would be a highly disputed territory for establishing bases. It would also be home to artillery and research and development laboratories to forge new weapons. It could even be a battlefield of its own as different countries attack each other's bases or lead ground invasions through the rocky landscapes. The meaning of one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind would take on entirely new interpretations in this dangerous war zone. With all the conflict erupting in space, the borders of the battle could continually expand as newer and more capable technologies develop. Eventually, the struggle could lead to a deadly conflict over Mars, the asteroid belt, or beyond. The repercussions for this war on earthly civilians would also be severe. The wide destruction of satellites would lead to a global breakdown of communications, navigation systems, and weather prediction technology. Economies would be devastated as all kinds of trade agreements would fall apart. And the budgets of all the world's most powerful nations would go almost exclusively to further advancements in the space military-industrial complexes. And while the battles would rage off the surface of the planet, there'd be no escape from the new reality of war. Every night, as you watch the stars, you'd catch glimpses of orbital bombardments easily visible to the naked eye. Now, you could be wondering, just how far would World War III in space go? And just how would it ever end? Well, at this moment, that's impossible to say, but you could certainly imagine that this kind of war would be almost entirely unpredictable. It would no longer be about taking over pieces of land on Earth. It would be about who could conquer the vastness of space. What would begin with satellite crossfire
could evolve to the construction of massive space stations that serve as bases for a new era of deep space exploration and conflict. And to take things even further, who's to say it would ever end at all? Or maybe it wouldn't be humans, but another advanced alien civilization that would swoop in and diplomatically end the conflict.
Forget everything you know about the United States of America. It's not united anymore, but divided into several independent nations. No, this isn't the result of a divisive election. This is what America's borders would look like if it were never stumbled upon by Christopher Columbus. What would this mean for the indigenous populations that already lived there? Could they have become a global superpower? And how would this impact the development of Europe? This is What If, and here's what would happen if Columbus never discovered America. In school, most of us are taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. But in reality, there's evidence that the Vikings and the Polynesians were there hundreds of years before. And most importantly, we can't really say he discovered anything when there were already millions of people living there. But Columbus arriving in America did spark massive amounts of exploration and colonization that led to the world as we know it. So, if he never arrived in America, would colonization still have happened? Before we go too far down the alternate history route, let's set a few real historical facts straight. First off, before Columbus arrived, the Americas were not just sparsely populated wildlands with tribes wandering through them. Instead, there were actually more people in the Americas living in complex and highly organized societies than there were in Europe. All of the communities had rich and mature cultures and established languages. There's even some evidence that indigenous populations of North and South America occupied the region for about 20,000 years before Columbus arrived. Since time immemorial, they had diversified so greatly in terms of culture that they spoke approximately 300 different languages. But that all changed when Columbus and the European colonizers arrived. A study from England's University College London found that the European colonization of the Americas indirectly contributed to the deaths of 56 million people by the year 1600. The study attributes the deaths to factors including introduced disease, such as smallpox and measles, as well as warfare and societal collapse. If the Americas had never been colonized by the Europeans, not only would many lives have been saved, but also various cultures and languages. Through colonization, the indigenous populations were labeled as Indians, they were enslaved, and they were forced to abandon their own cultures and convert to Christianity. If it weren't for this oppression, the indigenous nations would have continued to develop and progress. Modern-day California would be the most densely populated region, but the entire continent would be divided into different nations, much like Europe and Asia. Smaller tribes would get swallowed up by larger ones, and borders would continue to change throughout history. But one group that may have emerged as a dominant culture over the others would be the Iroquois. They were known as one of the strongest nations due to their successful agricultural practices and their ability to invade other nations. If Columbus hadn't brought colonization over to the Americas, then the Iroquois would probably have continued to grow their nation and surround much of the Great Lakes area and the Mississippi River. And our geographical borders wouldn't be the only things that would look different in this alternate timeline. Our diets would too. Wheat would not have been a staple in the American continents, as this is something introduced from Europe. And American foods like corn, tomatoes, and potatoes would not have been introduced to the Europeans. But in all honesty, even if Christopher Columbus didn't, beginning in 1450, had many nations looking for new lands to conquer and goods to exploit. So eventually, someone would have stumbled upon it. Wait a minute, Neanderthals are extinct? Before you laugh, check yourself. Neanderthal DNA is 99.7% identical to our own. And researchers claim that some humans might be carrying as much as 2% of the Neanderthal genome. Making things even weirder is that scientists recently recovered a nearly complete DNA sequence from a 50,000-year-old Neanderthal skeleton. So, in theory, Neanderthals could make a comeback. But how would they adapt? And how long would they survive? This is What If, and here's what would happen if Neanderthals hadn't gone extinct. Despite their physical differences, like being shorter and having longer skulls, we might have more in common with Neanderthals than we'd like to admit. First of all, their brains were bigger, which doesn't make them smarter than us, but they could communicate with one another. They settled in family communities and took care of the sick and the elderly. They also crafted sophisticated tools which would have been used for anything from hunting to possibly shipbuilding. They even cooked their vegetables and ate them, which is more than you can say. So, if Neanderthals are simply the beta version of what humans became, could they still live among us? Neanderthals, in fact, did live among us. For about 5,000 years, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals coexisted in Europe and likely interbred. This would explain why most Eurasians probably have at least 1% of the Neanderthal DNA in their genome, while anyone of African descent doesn't have any Neanderthal DNA since their ancestors didn't migrate through Eurasia. But with the Homo sapien population significantly outnumbering the Neanderthal population, it's likely that modern humans simply absorbed the Neanderthal species. Another theory is that we outcompeted them for resources during the last ice age, resulting in their extinction. But whichever theory is right, what if the concluding fact was wrong? What if Neanderthals were not extinct? If Neanderthals somehow evolved as a separate but very similar species to humans, how would they fare? Despite their communication and craftsmanship abilities, the laws of natural selection prove that Homo sapiens are superior, which means the survival options for Neanderthals wouldn't be that great. Barring the likelihood of early modern humans breeding them out of existence, Neanderthals probably would have become something like second-class citizens. Would we enslave them? Keep them in zoos? Or force them to fight? It's hard to say. Would the limits of their intelligence prevent them from fully integrating into modern society, or would they learn and evolve, just like Homo sapiens? Maybe they'd want nothing to do with us. Realizing how our differences outweigh our similarities, could we expect Neanderthals to establish their own communities and continue to exist independently of the developing world? It's hard to predict exactly how a species that went extinct about 40,000 years ago would behave today. But then again, maybe we just have to look around us. Neanderthals may be extinct, but we did evolve alongside them, and some of us inherited more than others. So think twice before you call someone a Neanderthal. It can be quite offensive.
Millions of years ago, the Earth looked very different. A huge landmass called Pangia covered about a third of our planet. But about 175 million years ago, the Earth broke up into continents and formed the world we know today. What if that had never happened? Where would your country be located? And how different would your life be? This is What If, and here's what would happen if Pangia had never broken apart. If Pangia existed today, in theory, you could drive from California to England, since they'd both be part of the same landmass. And although you may only think of Pangia as just another piece of land, it would be much more than that. It's played an integral part in human and animal evolution. If Pangia had not broken apart, you may not be here today. But let's assume it didn't, and that we survived and evolved to be the people we are today. What would the Earth be like? First, let's talk about where your country would be located. North America would be right here. Europe would be a lot closer, just to the east. Asia would be up north by Russia, and Antarctica would remain down south. India and Australia would be further south, connected to Antarctica. These countries that used to have hot climates would now be cold, covered with snow and ice. And those wouldn't be the only environmental changes. Regions in the middle of Pangia would have lush rainforests along their borders. And as you travel further inland, it would become a desert. This would be due to Pangia's landmass being so large. Rain, which comes from the ocean, wouldn't be able to travel far enough inland, leaving parts of Pangia practically uninhabitable by humans and other species. And weather up north would be different too, with Russia being much warmer than it is today. But the weather wouldn't be the only thing that would change. On Pangia, we might have less diversity of species. The species at the top of the food chain today would most likely remain there, but some of today's animals would not exist in Pangia. They wouldn't have the chance to evolve. Fewer animals might make it easier to travel, and on this modern version of Pangia, you'd probably want to do a lot of it. Luckily, you wouldn't have to go far. If you lived in Florida, you'd be right next to the Caribbean islands, Venezuela, and Brazil. You could visit all of these in a single day. And if you lived in Nova Scotia, Canada, you'd be driving distance from France, England, and Germany. Although this might sound like fun, a lot of countries would have new neighbors, which could cause some serious issues for some. Places like the United States, which used to have oceans on both sides of the country, would now have Africa on its east coast. If these countries didn't get along, things could get ugly. How much easier would it be to start a war in another country if they were just a short drive away? Transporting weapons, people, and supplies would all be faster and cheaper if certain countries were right next to each other.
What if the dinosaurs that went extinct 66 million years ago were able to survive the asteroid? Well, with a few evolutionary modifications, anything is possible. Today, we're going to modify the dinosaurs that went extinct, giving them all new traits in order to survive. Some might get big, some might be small, and some will even get extreme rock armor, capable of surviving the asteroid impact. This is What If, and here's what would happen if dinosaurs had evolved to survive the asteroid. Okay, first, let's revisit the mass extinction event that got us here in the first place, because clues to dinosaurs' survival lie at the scene of the crime. Why is that? Well, because we know some animals survived. While 75% of all species on Earth were wiped out, 25% found a way. What special superpower did each survivor have? Was it their bodies? Was it what they ate or how they lived? And keep in mind, it wasn't just the initial impact that did all the damage. There was a second extinction event right after. This killer asteroid starts as a small dot in the sky, but before you know it, a massive rock has struck Earth, creating a huge crater. The enormous force from the asteroid created a tremendous amount of heat. It was like billions of nuclear bombs exploding. The heat raised the temperature of the land, and it caused the rocks underneath the Earth to melt, tossing tiny molten particles into the air. These rained back down as hot, deadly shards. A massive impact, a super hot Earth, and
molten rock rain. Well, that's the first killer. And then, for those that somehow survived this, there was a second horror on the way. The massive cloud of ash that enveloped the Earth blocked out the sun, causing an impact winter. This lasted anywhere from 2 to 10 years. No sunlight or food for many of the creatures on Earth. This would have been a nightmare to get through, but some animals did manage to survive. Shrews, turtles, crocodiles, and some other creatures were able to get through both of these extinction events. So, if we applied some of their survival traits to the dinosaurs, would the dinosaurs be able to avoid getting wiped out? Okay, it's time to do a little gene splicing. Let's take a look at our favorite dinosaurs and see how they might have evolved to survive the asteroid. From T-Rex to Tiny Rex. Okay, let's start with my favorite, the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Weighing in at 7,000 kilograms, the T-Rex had a pretty difficult time surviving the asteroid. As terrestrial creatures, many T-Rexes would have died in the original heat pulse that radiated through Earth. Either that, or they would have been shredded by the rain of molten rock coming down from the sky. Well, not this time. We're going to help the T-Rex survive. We'll take some lessons from the Morgan eucodon, a small mammal that lived in burrows and scurried around underfoot during the age of dinosaurs. We'll give our T-Rex some really thick armor all over its body to combat the hail of shards. And those puny arms? Well, let's beef them up a bit by increasing their length and size, as well as giving them some bigger claws. This would allow them to dig burrows for extra protection. Will this be enough? Well, let's see what happens when the asteroid strikes again. Our modified T-Rex looks to be doing great. The heavy armor is protecting him from the shards, and he's running into his burrow for shelters. He's 12 meters long, so this burrow is a bit on the big side, but so far so good. Okay, now that the initial impact is over, a heat wave is happening. Widespread fires are raging across Earth. Our T-Rex, though, is still comfortable, hiding in his burrow, waiting for the fires to end. Now, although the T-Rex had a high energy requirement and had to eat relatively frequently, he should be able to survive a bit of starvation for now. I mean, a hungry stomach beats going extinct, right? After the initial devastation subsides, our T-Rex emerges from his burrow, only to find that Earth is now 6 degrees colder and much darker. This means finding food is going to be a huge issue. At first, our T-Rex could scavenge some asteroid kill, but with most other large land creatures now gone, how would this enormous carnivore survive? Well, it's going to be virtually impossible without food. That is, unless we give our T-Rex one more modification. Unfortunately, it'll change almost everything we know about this dominant dino. Let me explain. Almost every creature that survived the impact winter had this one common feature. They were on the smaller side. In fact, of the mammals that survived, the largest one was no bigger than a rat. So, sorry Rexy, but we're gonna have to shrink you down from a size 16 to a size 0. Okay, now you're Tiny Rex. And oh, one more thing, we're also going to modify your diet drastically. You're going to be an insectivore. Since there are no large herbivores to eat, you'll have to settle for feeding off the swampy carcasses of insects. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. But at least he should survive. Let's see what happens when the asteroid strikes again. Okay, Tiny Rex runs into its burrow like before and stays there for a while. It's now safe to come out. For a while, he's able to sustain himself on the remains of dead animals. And after that, well, there are swarms of insects hovering over the decaying vegetation everywhere. That's what our Tiny Rex eats. And he survives long enough to pass his genes on to the next generation, giving rise to a new generation of armored, burrowing insectivores. Tiny Rexes. Honestly, they're pretty cute. toothless velociraptor. All right, let's look at another star of the Jurassic Age, velociraptors. What would it take for them to survive? Well, these dinosaurs lived in Central and Eastern Asia during the late Cretaceous period. They were about 1.8 meters long and weighed about 45 kilograms, about as much as a chimpanzee. They were pretty good at pouncing quickly on their prey and liked eating small herbivores. There's one other feature that they had that's given us an idea to build on, and that's that velociraptors had fluffy, feathery arms. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't I see that in Jurassic Park? Well, when the movie was made, scientists hadn't yet figured out that dinosaurs had feathers. Now, velociraptors had one other feature just like birds. They had thin, hollow bones filled with air sacs, a powerful mechanism for staying well oxygenated. They could get oxygen both while inhaling and exhaling. Now, despite all this, unfortunately, they couldn't fly, which may have been a key factor in their downfall. All right, time for us to give our velociraptors a few key modifications that could help them avoid extinction. Now, similar to our T-Rex, we'll shrink them down. Then, we're going to give them wings so they can take flight when the asteroid strikes. This was one of the reasons birds survived. Some of them were able to fly away and avoid the initial blast. But just being able to fly won't be enough. These creatures will have to adapt and find food to survive the impact winter. What would they eat? Well, we'll have to give our velociraptors a taste for bird food. They could swoop down and prey on the small mammals scurrying about. Or they could search for seeds and nuts, which will still be around after the massive fires. Now, to pick those seeds out from dead forests, we'd better give them a beak, too, a key evolutionary advantage. And sorry, velociraptors, but we're getting rid of your teeth. In this new post-apocalyptic world, you're not going to need them. This will make sure you live to see another day. Yeah, this toothless velociraptor with its wings is definitely making it through the asteroid. Okay, so we've looked at the land and at the air. Well, now it's time to look at the sea. Michael Spinosaurus Phelps. The Spinosaurus was a large, semi-aquatic dinosaur with a massive sail on its back. It's kind of an odd-looking creature, 15.5 meters long with small hind legs, a predator who swam after fish. It wasn't really well adapted to land. In fact, this dinosaur was already extinct by the time the asteroid hit. But let's assume for a moment that it was around during the late Cretaceous period, because we think with a few modifications, we could help it survive the asteroid. And this time, we're going to look for some aspects of a creature that survived all 5 mass extinctions. The sharks, and you'll see why in a second. Unlike the shark, the sad thing about the Spinosaurus, well, it was a crappy swimmer. The fin on its back was seriously destabilizing. It made for a very difficult swim. Okay, so that 335 kilogram big back fin, it's gotta go. Or maybe become a much smaller dorsal fin. Let's streamline its body and shrink it a bit while we're at it, so it can glide, kind of like Michael Phelps. Now, another problem with the Spinosaurus? Well, we've got to swap out its whole breathing mechanism. Like the Velociraptor, it has lungs and a network of sacs inundating its hollow bones. We're going to replace this whole system with gills, and not your standard 5 gills, but a set of 7, so it can get enough oxygen whether it's in shallow water or the deepest ocean. Now finally, we'll give our Spinosaurus a swim bladder. That's a gas-filled sac which it can inflate or deflate whenever it likes. This way it can roam through different depths of the ocean. Well, one last trait before we go. The Spinosaurus was known for only eating a couple of things during its time. Well, our Spinosaurus, it can't be such a picky eater. Whether it's turtles or shellfish, sea snakes or smaller Spinosauruses, they're gonna eat whatever's served for dinner. Okay, our new and modified Michael Spinosaurus Phelps is all set. built to survive the asteroid. It'll dive deep when the top layers overheat, it can swim near and far, and in the beginning it'll eat all the dead fish that sink to the bottom. Later it'll eat anything. We're good to go. The butt-breathing Ankylosaurus. Okay, time for our last bit of genetic splicing. Now, sharks survived, but turtles did too. Is there a dino that could learn a few evolutionary tricks from the turtle or the crocodile? Well, let's look at the Ankylosaurus, the armored dinosaur with bony plates on its body and a powerful club-like tail. These large beasts were herbivores, eating tough leaves, pulpy fruits, ferns, and shrubs. They were also super slow-moving creatures. But come to think of it, that might actually be a good thing, because being sluggish is part of the evolutionary success story of both the turtle and the crocodile. For the Ankylosaurus to survive the asteroid, we're going to need one major change. Instead of being strictly land dinos, we're going to need them to be semi-aquatic. Now, coincidentally, semi-aquatic was my favorite 90s band. Oh, wait, that was Semisonic. Okay, in the hours after the asteroid strikes, as the Earth becomes super hot, we need a few Ankylosauruses near the shore to slip into the water. Now, they don't need gills, but like a turtle, we'll make them good at holding their breath underwater for a long time, like 45 minutes. This will get them through the first phase, when Earth is scalding hot. Now, given that any kind of food is going to be a problem for a while after the impact, our Ankylosaurus already has the evolutionary trait that's going to help it survive. Yeah, its sluggishness is just what we need right now. Just like a turtle, the less energy it uses, the longer it can go without food. Now, in addition, let's make our Ankylosaurus cold-blooded, so its body temperature is determined by its environment. This way, as the Earth gets colder during the impact winter, the Ankylosaurus's temperature can drop too, and its metabolism can slow further. The less energy it needs, the better. Maybe it hangs out underwater for a bit, brumating. This is the type of hibernation turtles do. And this is where the last body feature comes in. We're going to modify our Ankylosaurus so it can breathe through its butt. Yeah, I know it sounds ridiculous and sounds like maybe something Beavis and Butthead would say, but stick with me here. Turtles have cloaca, openings through which waste comes out. You know, they're rich in blood vessels, so they double up as a way to get oxygen when the turtle is underwater. Brumating. There you have it. A new generation of butt-breathing Ankylosauruses, which are semi-aquatic. They're also sluggish, cold-blooded, and can retreat underwater to brumate. This is all happening as they're protected by their bony plates. Maybe they'll curl their tail under their armor for protection when they sleep. So, now that these dinosaurs managed to avoid extinction, what does the future of Earth and mammals look like? Well, what was formerly known as the T-Rex is now equivalent to a small reptile, one that feeds on insects to survive. Not scary. Our toothless velociraptors continued to evolve, along with birds, and in the ocean, Michael Spinosaurus Phelps could evolve into a powerful fish, competing with big sharks and whales. The new butt-breathing Anky, well, it doesn't scare anyone either. Think of it as a new kind of elephant-like creature, docile and relatively harmless. Hundreds of thousands of years later, the dinosaurs that survived, along with the mammals entering the scene, would continue to evolve side by side. By wiping out the larger creatures and shrinking the T-Rex, the mammals and dinosaurs of the time would be on a more even footing. But Tiny Rex lacks one important thing: a big brain. Aww. Other small mammals at the time, like rats and squirrels, would be significantly smarter than Tiny Rex. They'd also have better senses, ones that could allow them to get around in the dark better. So there is a possibility that the Tiny Rex would go extinct due to the stiff competition at the time. But let's assume they're able to still evolve. Similar to our own timeline, future generations of mammals would have evolved into intelligent apes. Tiny Rex might have become middleweight Rex by this point, like maybe elephant or hippo-sized. But there's a good chance that the smart apes would escape from middleweight Rex just by living high up in the trees. Then we'd get to humans, eventually giving rise to humans. Now, in the early years, humans would hide from heavyweight Rex, but over time we'd invent weapons and begin to hunt them. Now, would our re-engineered dinosaurs ever grow to be as large as they were in the Cretaceous period? Give them another 100 million years and they just might.
It's the oldest question on Earth. Where did we come from? Some people may thank a creator from above, but what if the hand that created humanity wasn't divine? What if aliens brought life to Earth? How could a meteor carry life to our planet? Could microbes survive the cold vacuum of space? And does alien life already exist on Earth? This is What If, and here's what would happen if aliens brought life to Earth. When you think of aliens, your imagination might run wild with movie scenes and X-Files reruns, but technically, an alien includes anything not from Earth. And that broad definition opens up some intriguing possibilities. In 2017, astronomers detected a mysterious chunk from an exoplanet that entered our solar system. Called Oumuamua, this interstellar object is made from nitrogen ice, the perfect radiation shield for an organism that might be hitching a ride. After all, if this pancake-shaped rock can keep its ice formation while flying through the galaxy, then maybe life can not only exist beyond the solar system, but also travel frozen in space. But if an object like this slammed into Earth, would the organisms survive the impact? When our solar system was still forming, the chunk of rock that would become Earth floated around completely unprotected from meteors and asteroids. If an object like Oumuamua had landed on Earth during that time, it could have brought microbes and other organisms from deep space. This is called the panspermia theory, which states that matter from surrounding planets or objects from deep space might have brought life to Earth. But how could we test this theory? Researchers aboard the International Space Station found that bacteria survived on the panels outside the station. Even the extreme temperatures of space didn't kill the bacteria. Well, what does that prove? Well, if a spacecraft left from Mars with microbial life attached, those microbes could survive the trip to Earth. But let's go back to the early days of our planet. Almost 4 billion years ago, Earth went through a bombardment period. During this time, powerful meteor showers regularly rocked the surface of our world, and several objects the size of Oumuamua, about 800 meters long, crashed into the Earth. So if there were microbes deep within those meteors, they might have been cushioned from the impact. And that's pretty impressive considering meteors travel at speeds of up to 100 kilometers per second. And during that chaotic time, life began springing up all over Earth. After all, bacteria can thrive in temperatures as high as 113 degrees or be preserved at minus 196 degrees. So if those meteors had contained microbial life, it would have survived the impact and possibly planted the seeds of life. But how could we know if alien life is already here? Well,
that evidence is harder to find. We still haven't found life anywhere other than Earth, so thinking that life could have come from somewhere else might be a bit of a stretch. But in a system 400 light years away, we have found the elements of life. Using radio telescope technology, Danish researchers found glycolaldehyde, a simple sugar needed to produce ribonucleic acid, or RNA. This is the macromolecule responsible for making proteins and coding genes. Glycolaldehyde is floating out there in space, waiting for a carrier to bring it to a world like ours. But maybe it's already here. Amino acids and sugars, the building blocks of life, come in two versions that mirror each other. We call this phenomenon chirality, and we refer to the versions as left and right. But on Earth, all life contains left-handed shaped amino acids and right-handed shaped sugars. And that's unusual, as scientists creating amino acids in a lab would make half of them left-handed and half right-handed. So single shapes in amino acids and sugars could be an evolutionary function, or they could be an extraterrestrial influence. You know, whether life came to Earth from outside our solar system in a rock or on the bottom of an alien's foot, it's hard to ignore this theory when we think about our place in the universe. But what if our planet has spread life in the same way? What if ancient life escaped Earth? Well, that's a story for another What If.
Don't forget to click on the link in the description to start playing Conflict of Nations today. You'll get an exclusive gift, 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. But the offer's only available for 30 days, so click now.